Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 27th of October, and today is what I'm going to refer to as culmination day because we're seeing the culmination of the large-scale Russian advances within Selydovo itself and on its flanks, as we're now going to report on the near capture of that city, which the Russians are of course going to call Selydovo. We're also looking at really large-scale advances occurring in three villages. There are battles going on within those three villages in the southern Donetsk area, just east of Velika Novosilka. This is an area that I've been incessantly talking about. I've started every single video for the past couple of months with this part of the front line, and it's for a reason. It's because I saw the way the dynamics were unfolding in this particular area, and it was always going to be conducive after a certain point for deep Russian penetrations, given the fact that the elevation is on the Russian side and there aren't that many static defenses built within this vertical area spanning from the perimeter of Krakow to the current line of contact. This is a roughly 17-kilometer wide span of open fields that, of course, do have some static defenses that you can't always see on satellite imagery, but they're not well built in the sense that they were not built over several years. They were dug hastily within the confines of certain tree lines and not extended outwards past that. And you can see that manifested with what we do know based on the publicly available satellite imagery, that everything leading up to Andriivka and even just south of Andriivka is largely open fields that is not well defended. There's not a lot of depth in those areas. The region that actually does have the most depth is the immediate vicinity around Krakow, and that does not have as much significance if all the regions surrounding it are going to be overrun and don't have the same defensive capacity. But to zoom in and look at what's going on today, I want to show you guys the events beginning with Shakhtartske and Novoukrayinka, because the Russian forces are advancing and their fullest extent is not what I'm showing on the map. I'm being very conservative with my estimates for the advances here. You could see that in relation to the Shakhtartske axis, it's a Russian advance amounting to 8 square kilometers, and then towards Novoukrayinka, the Russian advance is nearly 10 square kilometers. Today, we know, based on footage from the 3rd and 20th Battalions of the Separate Presidential Brigade, that there were 9 Russian armored vehicles advancing along the paved road running from Zolotaniva to Shakhtartske. They were targeted with at least 17 FPV strikes from these two units combined. And again, there's no aftermath footage to tell us the extent of the damage because, again, a lot of these tanks or armored vehicles are very well protected with the turtle tank sort of build up on top. And so I'm not really sure if they suffered very significant damage, but definitely they were able to dismount a large amount of forces within the village itself, as was admitted by Ukrainian sources. And this is the most conservative estimation of the line of contact, wherein the Ukrainians no longer have a solid base within Shakhtartske, where the Russian forces, whereas they've been able to solidify themselves in the southern portion and are beginning to expand past that region, because to the east, you don't really have a strong Ukrainian defense here in the hinterlands between Shakhtartske and Novoukrayinka. Simply everything around it is falling apart, so there's no impetus for the Ukrainians to hold on in between. So any sort of groups or small squads that are operating here, they're falling back to Maximivka and Yasna Polyana. And then to the west, this is a region that also doesn't have that much density in fortifications. A lot of the defenses were built with the sort of perception that the defense would be directed towards repelling attacks directly from the south. You could see how it was envisaged on my map. And now the reality is the Russian forces have a wide array of means through which to reach Velika Novosilka. They have this route. They have, of course, all the open fields, but they also have the road coming in from Shakhtartske to Velika Novosilka directly from the east. So this is a part of a wider shaping operation, which is not just related to reaching Uspenivka or going through the depth to Andriivka in the wide future, but definitely also provides the Russians with an amazing point through which to launch attacks towards Velika Novosilka. And that's also why I was always adamant that this region would be the focal point of some wide-scale attacks. You can also see it over here with Novoukrayinka. Russian forces being able to infiltrate with relative ease into the village itself, and there were very little clashes on the outskirts. It was just the Russian forces getting control of Protistivka, and ever since being able to push westwards, and now out of nowhere pushing northwards. Simply no ability for the Ukrainians to counter it, given everything else that is unfolding. So you have the 40th Naval Infantry Brigade involved with both of these attacks on these two villages, and here in this video they stormed trenches near Novoukrayinka, getting control of them with very little resistance from the Ukrainian side. And then you could say something very similar about this region between Novoukrayinka and Bohoyavlenka. This region although there is no verifiable proof of the Russians being here, simply it's not logical for them to stay in these exposed positions that are now enveloped from three sides and are put under enormous strain, both logistically and also just due to the strikes coming from the Russians. And again, it's a relatively open area, not that many defenses. And so, inevitably, with the fall of the nearby settlements, the Ukrainians also will have to withdraw from this large pocket and large swath of open fields that they could have tried to drag their feet through, which means that also you'll have this highway leading to Uspanivka under more pressure. Bukhoyevlenka, the Russian forces, we talked about this yesterday, were able to establish themselves in the western warehouses and farmland. This indicates that they advanced along this particular direction. And since then, they've been able to expand into the settlement itself, largely taking it over, not completely as of now, but we do have geolocated footage to back this up. So you have the 36th Motor Rifle Brigade, one of the main units involved with the attacks in this region. They raise a flag at the top of the Kalinka kindergarten. And additionally, here you have the 14th Spetsnaz Brigade. They raised a flag in eastern Bukhoyevlenka, near the warehouse region in the eastern portion, near some dugouts as well. So you had a wide array of units, mainly from the 29th Combined Arms Army. So that would include 36th, 57th, and 430th brigades. And then I think 430th is regiment, respectively. You could see them marked here on my map. And these were involved not just with expanding past Vodiane and Bukhoyevlenka, but probably will be involved in future pushes to unite the large-scale vector from Konstantinivka and Antonivka with the one from Bukhoyevlenka. And you can see right now that there were initial reports from the Russian side that are not verified, so I didn't change the map to really align with this, but that the Russian forces have been able to advance along this ravine where I have the arrow mark that's moving and actually enter into the outskirts and southern portions of Yelizavetivka. So just keep an eye out for those developments over the next couple of hours. And what this means is that the Ukrainian forces that were trying to solidify control in Bukhoyevlenka and hold on to it for some time to just buy some sort of breathing space for Uspanivka, now they're going to have to withdraw further north, withdraw along this line of ponds and tree lines to Selydove, which is a very small settlement in nature, and it would be the final one before reaching what I would say is sort of the genesis of all of the Ukrainian defensive efforts in the region, Uspanivka specifically. Now, looking northwards, we're going to look more closely at Selydove because even though I'm showing this massive gray zone, it's really a matter of time before this western portion of the city falls under full Russian control. Ukrainian units from the 15th National Guard Brigade, they are the main unit that comprise the defense here, and they simply had no means by which to continue holding on to it. So they, in small squads, a lot of the time actually in armored vehicles, I would say more so than in Avdiivka, but this time they had a bit more of a window of opportunity and a realization that they were about to be enveloped, so they withdrew a lot of them in armored vehicles, which allowed them to leave faster. So we don't have yet wide-scale footage, although I do imagine that some videos will eventually be published of the troops that were left behind, either killed or captured, within mostly the eastern parts of Selydove, because those ones, the small squads that were probably bogged down in house-to-house fighting, they did not have the means by which to leave, because if they were to leave their positions, they would be targeted by the Russians and eventually getting pinned down. They either got killed or captured. But we're talking, for the most part, you had Ukrainian soldiers from the 15th Brigade leave through either open fields or through the specific road over here that I'm marking with this arrow, and then from there either branching out to the E50 highway or to Hryhorivka, and then from there to the local Ukrainian rear. But the Russian forces definitely did put a lot of pace into their advance here, and they were not met with that much resistance in the clashes that occurred in the central part of Selydove, allowing them to get control over large amounts of the apartment complexes without having to expend resources. Just imagine, once again, how many lives the Russians were able to save from their own ranks, from their own units that are advancing around here, that were recently rotated over the past couple of weeks for a new round of offensive actions. Now, because they were not forced to endure a grueling urban battle, they do have the operational capacity to continue advancing westwards once they fully solidify over here. So that's a very big win for the Russian forces. The fact that, and it's something that is very similar with what happened in Avdiivka, Novohordivka, and various other large populated regions, because the urban battles did not extend it for that long, especially in the populated dense center. it means that a lot of lives and resources that would have been utilized there could be used to continue advancing westwards. That's what I believe we'll see. But for the time being, you have the Russians raising the flag over the Selydove City Council building. They removed the Ukrainian flag, and they also raised it, of course, over the technical school. We're going to see soon videos coming out of the western part of the city, which is less dense in nature. But for now, we have Ukrainian proof indicating that the Russians are in Vishneve. Some Russian sources claim that they are in control of the entire locality, which would give the Russians, again, a very, very good point through which to harass the retreating Ukrainian squads and then eventually advance along the rail line, because we know the Russians have mastered the arts of sending in squads and sometimes even accompanying motorcycles or vehicles through those windbreaks and then dismount in villages. You have a whole host of villages over here that are not that well defended. Their eastern perimeters were not built up for this because there was not an expectation that the Russians would be in this area at this point in time. The Ukrainians, they really did underestimate the time frame at which the Russians would be able to arrive in this region, and their logistics regiments only arrived a couple of months ago in areas further westwards near Dnipro to begin large-scale defensive works, because now you can see a very clear open route. Again, we're not talking about anything in the short term, but we're seeing just as a long-term direction, besides the obvious Russian ability to flank Pokrovsk from the south, they have the ability to expand westwards and are now only about 25 kilometers away, or the Ukrainian line of contact is only about 25 kilometers away from Dnipro Oblast. So that's something that they are taking very seriously, and only now are the Ukrainians sort of heeding those concerns that have been raised for a while by the local garrison in this region about building up defenses over there. But anyhow, in Vishneve, you have proof of the Russian capture. So you have Ukrainian artillery strike near the rail station because they saw a Russian gathering over there. And then here you have the 3rd Motorized Battalion of the 228th Regiment, Russian unit that is also operating around here. They raised a flag in Vishneve. I think a couple of soldiers were active here. So, yeah, that's very good proof for the Russian side. And also the Russian sources, they claim that there is much more territory under their control in the northern portion of Selydove than I have marked. And that could certainly be true. I just haven't seen proof of it. There's allegations that the Russians were able to advance along the E50 highway at a depth that nearly reaches the junction over here with the paved route that sort of expands then southeastwards to Selydove itself. So that would be probably 3 kilometers away from where my current mapping of the situation is, and would also imply a large-scale Russian base of control that is already established near the 11th quarter of Selydove, and then also very close to Hryhorivka and pretty close to Donetsk. That's something that has to be kept in mind as we're going forward. So, of course, if any proof comes up in the future, in the coming hours, to indicate that, then I'll change the mapping accordingly. And there really were a litany of Russian units involved in this operation. The fact of the matter is, the same units that were assaulting at the beginning of the Selydove battle 2 months ago, they either are no longer there because they rotated out, or in between they were able to receive some rest and only now are joining in. And so that really did help with the level of energy for the forces advancing over here. There are now videos of these certain elements walking through the center of Selydove, and you can see that there's not that much damage. That's because the fighting wasn't in those regions for long enough to even cause damage. You can see some scorch marks, of course, on the apartment buildings. That's understandable, but not extreme damage to many of the houses there, let alone the apartments. Not anything occurring to the skeletons of those structures, which means that, the Russians are going to be able to make use of it for their own purposes, for placing troops over there and then expanding westwards. You have 35th Motor Rifle Brigade. I want to just mention some of the units that were involved in the operation that was involved in clearing up over here. You had 2 regiments, specifically of the 27th Motor Rifle Division, the new division that was established over the past year, and they were very important with this operation. You have a few other territorial motor rifle regiments that I have sprinkled throughout the fighting over here, and you can see them. You have the 71st Special Purpose Battalion. It was involved in attacking around the Korochenka mine, as you may recall from the previous video. You have 228th Motor Rifle Regiment. Here you have the, 55th Mountain Motor Rifle Brigade. They were definitely involved. 15th Motor Rifle Brigade, I think, also had a certain level of involvement, but its units are sort of split up between various sectors, including further to the north, and even, I believe, a certain company or battalion operating in the Kursk region. So, yeah, that's just part of it. Also, some DPR units that I did not mention. Really as a post-mortem, as we're looking forward, this means that the Russian forces do have a continued impetus, which will allow them to expand deeper into settlements over here. The goal of the Ukrainians, I would say, should be to establish a defense line in between the current line of contact and the final ring of defenses before reaching Pokrovsk outskirts, because you wouldn't want the next fighting to shift so close to Pokrovsk, wherein the Russian forces could already establish an artillery base to begin firing into the city. That's something that would really decrease the extent to which the Ukrainians could buy time within Pokrovsk, because clearly the Ukrainians are trying to hold on for the city for as long as possible. And not just that, but also maintain a solid defense line around the eastern perimeter for as long as possible. That will all be undermined if you have this very strong Russian pressure coming in from the south, which will give the Russians an option to just attack head on and also then put pressure from the south. And so definitely the Ukrainians do need to take advantage of whatever local defenses they have. They have to send in a certain level of reinforcements, I would imagine, coming in from this northern portion of the front line near Hordivka and Mykolaiivka, where there has been a relative stabilization. So some of those brigades should definitely be sent in to plug in the gaps. And they should try to coalesce around some of these villages. But definitely the Russians are going to have the momentum going forward along these rail lines. Just a quick word on Novohordivka number 3 mine. There's another piece of footage from the Russian 1,441st Motoreth Regiment of grenade drops onto a squad from the Skala Assault Battalion as they were dismounting their forces from a Bradley. So that's just a bit of further proof to show that the Ukrainians do still have forward operating positions in this mine. But now let's move on. In the Zabalka district of southern Toretsk, you can see another geolocation of Ukrainian forces once again advancing. Here it is an FPV strike on a Ukrainian squad that was walking through really the ruins of the northeastern part of the district, because this district is simply experiencing so much damage. The houses here are much smaller and don't have the materials that can withstand large-scale shelling. So the Russian or Ukrainian advance area amounts to about 500 meters northwards, and it's 12 hectares. This probably is a recent video because we've seen a cascade of footage come out recently from Zabalka indicating a Ukrainian presence in the southern portion. This new northern advance, though, this is new, and it does put a lot of questions about the remaining Russian positions that may or may not be active in northern Zabalka. So we don't necessarily know if the Russians are still here. Initially, the Russian breakthrough into Zabalka was very thin in terms of the proof of it. There definitely was some, but the extent, it was not fully understood. And so the Ukrainians, once the Russians stopped putting immense pressure in this region, had the ability to regroup near the southern portion of Zabalka and to the west near the landfills and conduct their localized counterattacks. Because definitely in Toretsk, there has been a decrease over the past 2 weeks in Russian activity. The Ukrainians took advantage of that to retake some, but not all, of the Russian positions that were taken over in the late September period. And that's just to really prepare for the next wave of Russian assaults. They want to have as favorable of positions as possible. As a quick update from the north towards the Oskil River, you have this video released by the Russian side of a drone placing a flag atop an electrical tower in Travneve. Now, the drone did it, but the Russians claim that they have control over the settlement. I don't know if that's true, and there should be proof or Ukrainian sources speaking on the matter if it is correct. The issue is, if that is the case, and even if it isn't, because we're still heading in that direction, it would mean that this chain of villages over here, marked with an X, has fallen to the Russian hands or is in the process of doing so. These chains of villages, as I call them, they're intrinsically connected together. You have all of the local squads and then companies operating here and moving resources around. And it serves as the final buffer before reaching this line of trenches, which is extremely important, this line. The Russian forces, if they were to capture this X, it's located on really high elevation. There's a massive ridge that the Russians are not in control of, but are very close to reaching, that the Ukrainians actually have on the line of contact. And now losing that would give the Russians a perfect vantage point to overlook the trenches that are currently built, that you can see marked up with these red lines. And that would really be a big deal to exert fire upon the Ukrainian defenders there, not just in this line, but also the secondary line that is supposed to defend the perimeter of Borova. Not to mention the fact that Travneve has a direct paved road leading into Borova. So it would be the perfect sort of kickstart for broader operations to reach the city, one of the largest cities that the Ukrainians have control over on the Oskil River, probably the second largest behind Kupiansk. So definitely something to keep an eye on. Besides that, you have this report from the Ukrainian side of a Russian advance north of Samakivka, amounting to 7.6 square kilometers. And in this case, it is largely just open fields, but it does pave the way for future assaults in the direction of Lozova, and also creates a precarious situation for the remaining Ukrainian squads that are in the salient between Pischane and Samakivka. The goal for the Ukrainians here is to just drag out for as long as possible. The defenses here are not well built, and so they're also just very spread out. But because the Russian focus isn't necessarily on this region, they've been able to just stay in their lane. But the thing is, if there is substantial Russian pressure coming in on the rear, then they would be forced to leave very quickly. And that would also entail the loss of large swaths of open fields leading towards the actual defense lines that were built a couple of kilometers westwards, that are really acting as a final measure before the Russians could reach the Oskil River in these locations here marked with an X. Also, interestingly, I just heard a report from the Russian side, and this is not verified yet, but they claim that the Ukrainians tried crossing over the Bryansk border. So that's way to the north, on the northern part of the border between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And you could see that it occurred in the Klimovsky district of Bryansk. So they claim that the Ukrainians crossed over in this direction with 10 to 15 people, and that 3 of them were killed during the clashes with the Russian military and border guards, and some were wounded on the Ukrainian side. And they were wounded specifically located within Russian territory during that incident. And right now, they claim that the incident is over. But we'll have to see if we get additional elaboration on the full details by tomorrow. But I will say that it's not the first time this happened. There have been a few raids since the end of August, also in September, if I recall correctly. But it was never anything too significant when the Russians reported on it in those incidents. If we're to look at the final advance that occurred over the past 24 hours, that is in the Velika Novosilka sector, or a bit to the west of it. You have this Russian advance amounting to 10 square kilometers, and it occurred just northwest of Prudny. Finally, the Russians are verified in control of all of Levadne, this small hamlet, and along with all of the surrounding fields. The Russian forces were able to reach the line of ravines previously under control of the Ukrainian side, which means that they're only a kilometer or two away from Novodarivka. They are also now in control, or have access to, the ridge that leads to the line of defense that the Ukrainians have built up in this region. This is really important for Ukraine's broader defensive goals in this triad region between the Dnipro, Zaporozhye, and Donetsk. And it is also a weak point in certain regions further to the north that could lead to exposing the Ukrainian rear positions in this chain of villages around Uspenivka and Pavlivka, Novomikhailivka, leading all the way northwards to the various logistics nodes that connect Zaporozhye to Dnipro. So I think that the Russians are deliberating about a advance in this region and attacking here, but it's still lower on their list of priorities, because I do think that one of the most important Russian objectives at the moment is related, first of all, to Selydove and expanding westwards from there, but also the continued pressure and continued penetrations in these open fields that are located north of where the current yellow polygons are marked. So keep an eye out for all of that. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.